Will Glasgow is the Australian's North Asia correspondent, and he's joining me to talk about something that I've got to admit I had not spent a lot of time thinking about. It's how the Japan-China relationship is influenced by views on Taiwan and also views on Australia. There's a Japanese pop star called Ayumi Hamasaki. I think you've compared her to Kylie Minogue. She's absolutely huge and huge in China as well. She was due to play a gig in Shanghai, but ended up playing to an empty stadium. What happened?
Yes, so she's due to play, and then the day before, her 14,000 fans who had sold out at the whole venue before they turned up, the concert was abruptly cancelled. Well, or at least cancelled to the public. Now, the the Chinese officials have claimed force majeure. And they don't explicitly say what has happened, but of course, the reason is Chinese officials trying to make a point have cancelled this because they think it's inappropriate for a Japanese pop star to be entertaining Chinese audiences during this moment of unhappiness. And they don't want, I mean, one of the lines the Chinese government has maintained throughout this is that the Chinese public are so angry themselves about what the Japanese Prime Minister said that they themselves are going to boycott Japanese products. The Chinese Communist Party acts as if it's this sort of natural backlash amongst the Chinese people. And look, it is the case that there are some angry nationalists, some angry Chinese nationalists, but it's also the case that there's loads of people in China who continue to like the Japanese pop stars I liked before, who still like sushi, who still like to travel to, would like to travel to Japan if their government wouldn't block them. So the cancelled concert is a really striking example of the Chinese Communist Party making decisions for its own people to boycott things. We saw this in Australia in a massive way back in 2020 when the Chinese ambassador said in an interview that was threatening the economic coercion that was going to come. And he said maybe the Chinese people won't want to buy Australian beef or drink Australian wine. Well, the truth was the Chinese people never got a say in that. The Beijing put a huge politically motivated tariff on Australian wine into China, so it was just priced out of the market. And it's the same kind of idea. Beijing claiming that it's the public that's boycotting these products, whereas actually it's the government making these decisions.
What is Japan's position on China and on Taiwan?
Japan's got a really complicated and long history with Taiwan, and it's very well remembered in China. Taiwan was a Japanese colony. It was the model Japanese colony. So Taiwan, or Tokyo, ruled Taiwan from 1895 to the end of World War II, 1945, so a 50-year period. And there was some horrendous colonies Japan had around Asia, particularly South Korea, or what's now South Korea, was just ravaged by the Japanese, treated appallingly. And within China itself, particularly in the northeast, what the Japanese called Manchuria. The memory on the mainland of Japan and Imperial Japan is of this nightmarish force, whereas in Taiwan, it's much more complicated. Taiwan was set up as as I said, a model colony for Japan, and the Japanese wanted to use it to show they were an equal of any Western power. They weren't to be colonized. They were like the British and German and other European colonial powers, and they wanted to show in Taiwan what they could do. So they left a big legacy of urban infrastructure. They sort of paved the roads, and it sounds a bit like the Monty Python sketch. They what the Romans did for them, right? But it actually is remembered in Taiwan that people, literacy rates skyrocketed under the Japanese. Sewage systems were installed, roads were installed, all this kind of thing. Up until the end of World War II, China's ruled by the nationalists, the Kuomintang. Now, when the Civil War breaks out after the end of World War II in 1945, at that point, Taiwan goes from being a Japanese colony to being ruled by the Republic of China. But within 4 years, the communists win the Civil War. The Nationalist Army retreats across the strait to Taiwan. And so For them, initially, Taiwan is a base where Chiang Kai shek is going to use to reclaim the mainland. For the people in Taiwan, their experience was World War II ended, and they thought, haha, finally, we're free of the Japanese, we're free of our colonial overlord, we can be independent. But then in arrives this new force. And originally they welcomed the nationalists in 1945, but it wasn't long before the Nationalist Army was imposing itself very violently on the Taiwanese. In came millions, literally millions of KMT, Kuomintang soldiers into Taiwan, and then they dominated and ruled the society in a very authoritarian way right until the late 1980s. So it's a really, really complicated history, but it means that for people in Taiwan, even, how Japan's seen, how the Communist Party is seen, depends so much on were you in Taiwan when the nationalist forces came in 1945 and then surged in 1949, or were you one of those who came from the mainland? From the Chinese Communist Party perspective, Taiwan is this base where their enemies fled, and it's this unfinished piece from the Civil War. So there's so much complicated history and some very raw emotions still about all this stuff.
In today's context, it's easy to think of Taiwan as kind of this, peace-loving island state that just wants to be left alone. As you say, the perception is very different coming from mainland China. They, of course, see Taiwan as a place where, as you say, rebellion can foment or a threat can exist. They're very unequivocal about wanting to take Taiwan for themselves, to bring it under the umbrella of the Chinese Communist Party. But again, we come back to that idea of Taiwan having some agency, and they're living out that agency in their modern relationship with Japan. So what's Taiwan doing in relation to Japan now?
Well, yeah, under this current government led by President William Lai, or Lai Ching-te, he's the successor of a previous president from the same party, the Democratic Progressive Party in Taiwan. And under that, so they've been in power and or had the presidency in Taiwan since 2016. And during that period, there's been a real thickening of the relationship between Taiwan and Japan. So that really got underway in a big way when Shinzo Abe was the prime minister in Japan, but it's just continued as prime ministers have changed in Japan. Right now, you're seeing that kind of flare up really spectacularly. So the new Japanese Prime Minister Takeshi she sees Abe as her political mentor. She's from the same party as Abe, the Liberal Democratic Party in Japan, which has ruled the country for most of its post-war history, only a few years when it hasn't been in power. And they've got traditionally, that party has close ties with Taiwan themselves, and particularly the conservative faction that she's from. That's particularly the case. I mean, Abe, once he was stood down as prime minister, he started visiting Taiwan a few times. And Takeshi, she was in Taipei only in April. That was back when she was a backbencher, but she visited to see President Lai and saw him in the presidential office. 7 months later, as it happened, she became the Japanese prime minister. Now, she'd never do that trip as the Japanese prime minister. Like Australia and almost every other country, Taiwan has unofficial relations with Tokyo. Japan doesn't officially recognize it as an independent state. It recognizes Beijing, but there's real they call it people-to-people links. But in the Japanese-Taiwan case, it's way more than that, partly because the Japanese ruled the place for 50 years.
The Australians published an opinion piece by the former Japanese ambassador to Australia, Shingo Yamagami, in which he's very directly accusing Australia of not doing enough to support Japan as it tries to assert itself against China, particularly over this issue of Taiwan. This is all very delicate, and the Chinese regard any kind of mention of Taiwan as deeply provocative. What's Japan's kind of end game here, and how could Australia possibly assist without making things kind of even more hot?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a very interesting contribution from the former ambassador, and he's right that when he was the ambassador, Japan's ambassador to Australia, I mean, he was really unusually vocal in his support for the Morrison government then and for Australia as it was being coerced by China. So he's saying, I mean, you could say not unreasonably, Japan stood up for Australia. Where are you now? Beijing, when it gets in these moods, when it's being, waging a campaign of vengeance, you get involved or support, in some ways at your peril, right? You can invite that same, they sort of extend these economic coercion campaigns to others. So, I mean, I think what's not helping Australia or any other country in this is the Americans, right? Donald Trump, the American president, one of the few figures in the international system who's got the power behind him to speak clearly to China on this kind of thing. He said nothing publicly to support Japan or even indicate any kind of support in this dispute. Far from it. He's actually spoke to Xi Jinping. Now, then he spoke to Prime Minister Takeshi. In his conversation with Xi, on the readout after it, he didn't mention at all any conversation about Japan or Taiwan. The Chinese then released that Taiwan wasn't just in the phone call, it was a dominant part of it, took up almost half of their conversation, according to the Chinese. And then after the call with the Japanese Prime Minister came out and said she'd had that call and gave a bit of an account of what they spoke about, but Trump said almost nothing about it. What is clear is there's no statement from the American president so far to give the Japanese Prime Minister public support. And that's the world that, the Albanese government and all other American allies have to operate within.
Will Glasgow is the Australian's North Asia correspondent. Thanks, Will.